Well, it's that time of year again. Good old Halloween. Now, should probably do a special review for said occasion. I don't know. Minnie, you have any ideas?
Other than getting this flaming jack-o'-lantern away from your consoles? No.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm completely struck. Ow!
What's the matter now? Did you pull a muscle when you opened the door?
Well, I don't know. When I was outside, just coming back from the grocery store, and the mailman bit me.
Ooh, maybe the mailman was a zombie, and you're gonna turn.
Oh, come on, that's ridiculous. How do you think I'm a zombie now?
Come to think of it, I just saw a zombie movie where blood comes out of their eyes. Maybe that happened to you, too.
Do you see blood coming from my eyes right now?
Actually, yes.
What do you mean, Oh, no. Am I actually gonna turn? What am I supposed to do?
Okay, calm down, calm down. I know exactly where to look for this. I just saw this infection in a movie called 28 Days Later and its sequel 28 Weeks Later. Maybe if you watch these movies, you can find some sort of cure. I wouldn't know. I fell asleep during both of them.
Well, looks like I got some movies to review. Let's go. Alright, 28 Days Later, the film that gave more life to this undead film genre. In terms of the history of 28 Days Later, there isn't much to talk about. According to a review with Creative Screenwriting, the concept of the film was first brought up by Alex Garland, author of The Beach. After the motion picture adaptation of The Beach had released, Garland mentioned to the eventual producer of 28 Days Later, Andrew MacDonald, who was also working on the production at the time, the idea of a story with running zombies. They went back and forth with several drafts, and as Garland explained, he was inspired by zombie movies as well as games such as Resident Evil. 28 Days Later would come to release in 2003, directed by Danny Boyle, the director of the film adaptation of The Beach, written by Alex Garland, and produced by Andrew MacDonald. The movie was released widespread in the UK and across around 1,500 screens in the United States. 28 Days Later received amazing financial success at the box office. With an initial budget of about £5 million, it grossed around £6.1 million in the UK, while it took $45 million in the US despite the limited release. Critics didn't hate it either. It currently holds an 87% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 73 out of 100 on Metacritic. So, what's my take on it? What is my take on this ever so popular film 15 years after its release? Let's find out. By the way, general story spoilers incoming. Don't want to upset anyone. So the story of 28 Days Later begins with a group of animal rights activists breaking into a laboratory in Cambridge who find a scientist in a room with a bunch of chimpanzees. When he's discovered, the scientist begs for the activists to not release the chimps as they are infected with quote-unquote rage. Ignoring his cries, the chimps are released and infect everyone in the room. We're given our title sequence, and then 28 days later, according to the film, a bicycle courier named Jim wakes up in the middle of an abandoned hospital. As he makes his way outside, he discovers that not is all well and good in London, as the whole of the town is abandoned, or so he thinks, until he finds out that London has become a veritable zombie playground. After he joins up with a group of survivors who explain the situation, Jim decides to join them in the struggle for survival. I don't want to say much more about the story of 28 Days Later, as the ambiguity about the setting of post-apocalyptic London is one of the film's biggest strengths. The world has a feeling of gloominess about it that helps build a strong emotional connection with the characters. Speaking of the characters, each of them are acted out marvelously. Not every character is given the best scripts, however, but I'll get to that later on. The music by John Murphy is awesome. His main theme for the series, titled In the House, aka In a Heartbeat, is one of my favorite songs from the zombie film genre, if not just one of my favorite songs from movies in general. It turns from pure fear to hell-bent determination and desire the next, and it fits so well with this type of movie. I know I've really been praising this movie a lot so far, but now that I've gone over all the positives I want to get into my biggest criticism with this film, and the thing that borderline ruins it for me. The camera work. Now, I get that they were going for a shaky cam, oh, you're in the action kind of angle, but it just doesn't work. Half the time, because of the weird camera angles and how much it was shaking, I actually had trouble determining what was happening. I mean, just look at this. I'd rather deal with the camera work in Transformers than this.
You know, with how wonky those cameramen look, maybe they got the same disease you have.
Bite me.
If you don't find that cure soon, it's you who'll be doing the biting.
It might not be a bother to some people, but to me it was a major drawback and the thing I hated about the movie the most. Another thing I don't like is that Jim just turns into an unlikable douchebag in the film's second act for almost no discernible reason. He seems to enjoy nearly getting killed by the infected, almost as if it's the equivalent of skydiving to him. Given how old the film is, the quality is pretty grainy too, at least if you watch it on an HD TV like I did. Not really a flaw of the film itself, more just a product of the times and the budget. Overall, 28 Days Later is a mixed bag of a film for me. I love the concept and the story, but the camera work seriously made me nauseous, and I had a hard time rooting for the main character half the time because he was being so unlikable. Thankfully, the third act kinda makes up for it despite being pretty ridiculous. The effects are awesome, and like I said, the story's enough to keep you going through just to see what the fate of these characters is. The ending isn't as happy as a finding a cure situation, but it does set up an opportunity for a sequel, which we would eventually receive in 2007 in the form of 28 Weeks Later. We better find this cure fast, because I don't really know how much longer I can last. Oh. 28 Weeks Later was directed by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, while also being co-written by him, Rowan Joff, Enrique Lopez Levine, and Jesus Olmo. It was produced by Enrique Lopez Levine, Alon Reich, and the only one of the three main creators of the first film returning, Andrew McDonald. The film released in 2007 to mostly positive responses. It currently holds a 71% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but after my experience with the last film, is that score warranted for this film? Well, for the sake of my skin, let's find out. Alright, so the prologue of 28 Weeks Later... the prologue of 28 Weeks Later takes place in the middle of the initial outbreak as a man named Don is attempting to survive with his wife and a group of survivors when their house is attacked by the infected. In the heat of the moment, Don chooses to make a harrowing escape and runs for his life, leaving the others to die. 28 weeks after the initial outbreak, the infected die of starvation, and the NATO forces assist with getting London back on its feet as they help to clean up and populate the Isle of Dogs. Among the people populating the island are Don and his two children, saved from the infection by being out of the country at the time. The silence doesn't last though, as another outbreak occurs, the NATO forces are given a shoot-to-kill order for everyone, and Don's children get separated from him. With the assistance of a rogue sniper, a NATO scientist is determined to get Don's children out of the quarantine area as she believes Don's son Andy holds the key to developing a cure to the rage virus. 28 Weeks Later seems to have less grainy image quality than 28 Days Later, which makes watching it much easier. Unfortunately, it still suffers from the same shaky cam issues as its predecessor, but it feels less prevalent, so I can almost forgive it. Acting is acceptable, but not as good as the first. It just feels stale and boring. In my opinion, the best actor in the whole movie is Robert Carlyle as Don, as he puts in some genuine emotion, but he's barely on screen. The children put on believable performances though, so at least that's good. Special effects are about on par with the first movie, but still decent, and the soundtrack is still awesome. I think the main two things that shoot 28 Weeks Later in the foot are the story and the pacing. The story of the first movie was simple, yet effective. It felt so creepy, yet enjoyable to discover the world with Jim as he tried to figure out what he wanted to do in the situation he was handed. In 28 Weeks Later, all the ambiguity of the first movie is gone, and what you're ultimately left with is just a standard zombie film that does nothing to differentiate itself from others. The pacing just leaves you feeling so unbelievably bored that you feel like you'll turn into a zombie yourself. It's a shame, too, because 28 Weeks Later has what I consider to be the best scene in the entire franchise, where in the prologue, Don runs for his life away from the infected after they storm his house. You can see the sweat and fear in his face as he sprints through the field as In a Heartbeat plays in the background, and it's just a masterpiece of atmosphere and tension. If the rest of the movie was as good as this, I'd almost say the scene would make it worth watching. As it stands, though, 28 Weeks Later is just a mess of a zombie flick. It has good moments here and there, but it doesn't reach its full potential. It feels like 50 other movies you've seen already 100 times before, especially nowadays, and it doesn't even have that uplifting ending that the first one did. I don't think I can recommend this one to anyone. Even if you want to see how the franchise is concluded thus far, it just really isn't worth it.
So, how does it end? You mean they never found a cure?
But if there's no cure, then... no. I'll be right back. Oh! Oh. It's just a bad dream.